We are live. One sec. Okay. Looks like it's needing. Okay. I think it is working right now. So, Mr. Achler, thank you so much for coming. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for attending this webinar. Towards the end of the webinar, we will be having a Q&A session, so feel free to write your questions into the YouTube live chat. This video will also be posted later on the Junior Economic Club's YouTube channel. So make sure to subscribe and be aware of everything economics. Oops, sorry. I welcome our special guest today, Mr. Mark Achler. Mr. Achler, could you give us a description about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Achler, and I am the Managing Director of Math Venture Partners, which is a venture capital fund. And I like to say that I make entrepreneurs' dreams come true because we provide the capital to help them grow their business.
Cool. That's great. Thank you so much. And so I think we can start off with the topic of interviewing and how to interview for a job. So how would you prepare for a job interview what give us some of the tips that you would just go through?
Yeah, so I think one of the best ways I can frame this up is to tell a short story. So you guys might remember, I know you all know Groupon, and Groupon's here in Chicago, and when it started back, at least 10 years ago, I got a call from a 23-year-old son of a good friend of mine, and he said, I'm interviewing for a sales job at Groupon. Would you help me prepare for the interview? I went, of course. And this is what I told him to do. I said, I want you to go and cold call 10 local merchants, and I gave him a list of questions to ask the merchants to understand how they felt about Groupon, or would they use Groupon. So he did that. He cold called 10 local merchants. He came over to my house. We talked about what he learned, and then he went to the interview. The interviewer asked him what I think is one of the biggest trick questions. The interviewer said, so tell me about yourself. And the reason, and perhaps some of you have been in a job interview, maybe for a summer job, and you've been asked that question, so tell me about yourself. And everybody answers the same way. We say, well, here's my background, here's my experience, I did this, I did that. That's who I am. But that's not what the interviewer is asking. What the interviewer really wants to know is, I've got a job. In order to do the job, I need to hire somebody with a certain set of skills, depending on what the job is, and a certain set of experiences. And most importantly, I'm looking for culture fit. I'm looking for somebody who has the personality and the values, work ethic, that problem solving, that will fit into the company. I want to make a good hire. So when they ask the question, tell me about yourself, that's really what they're asking. And so what this young man said when he got asked that question, he said, well, I'm so excited to be here. And that's the first lesson, is people want to hire people who want to be there. If you're just phoning it in and you don't want to be there, don't apply. So he said, I am so excited to be here. I discovered Groupon about 6 months ago. Me and my buddies, we've been using it all the time. We go try it out at different restaurants. This was in the very beginning, early days of Groupon. And when I told my friends I was coming for this interview, they were all jealous. And I realized that I understood the end user because that's me, I'm the end user. But I didn't understand the customer, the merchant. So in order to prepare for this job interview, I went and I cold called 10 local merchants in my neighborhood and asked them all sorts of questions about Groupon. Would you like to know what I found out? And the interviewer went, of course, I'd love to find out. So he goes, here's what I found out. About a third of the merchants I talked to had already heard about Groupon, and they had tried it, and they loved it. And I asked them all sorts of questions about why they loved it, and I found out that it was really cost effective, that it broadened their reach, that they were able to have a much draw from a much larger audience, and it was very successful, and it was incredibly cost effective relative to other forms of advertising, and they loved it and wanted to do it again. About a third of the people I talked to, the merchants I talked to, hated it, or they had a friend who tried it and hated it, and I asked them all sorts of questions about that. And I said, why? And I found out that sometimes there's a real art to the offer, and if the offer was too good, too many people came, and it was a bad service experience, and the merchant lost money, and they were the wrong type of customers because they only came once and they weren't repeat customers from the neighborhood. And so I realized that it's not enough, that there's a real art to making the offer the right type of offer to make it effective. And then about a third of the people I talked to had never even heard of Groupon. It was in the early days. And I was really excited, and I told them all about it. And guess what? Here's an order. He actually came to the interview with an order in hand for a sales job. He was the first person in the history of Groupon, first salesperson in the history of Groupon to actually come to an interview with an order already in hand. And from that experience, I came up with, I have 3 empathy rules. And this is about how to interview for a job. So the first rule is do your homework. And I really mean do your homework. Most people, when they interview for a job, they just show up. They just walk into the interview, they go, here's my resume, hire me, I'm a smart person. They just show up. What this guy did is he went and he didn't just go on a website. He cold called 10 local merchants, and he interviewed 10 local merchants, and he found out from the customer's point of view what they cared about. He demonstrated his ability to sell and to understand the customer. The next rule, so the first rule is do your homework. Put in the extra effort. That will immediately differentiate you. Second rule is it's not about you. Really, it's not about you. It's about the person sitting across the table from you. It's about who they are and what they need. It's not about you. And it's interesting, as teenagers, you tend to be really focused on who you are and what you need. And the reality is, it's not about you, it's about the company and what they need. And the more you can understand that, the more higher the likelihood that you'll get a job. And the third rule is bring a gift. And so what I mean by this is not a real gift. What I mean is add value to the interview. So in this example, the guy was interviewing for a sales job, so he brought an order. Actually brought an order. There's always something of value you can add to a conversation when you're interviewing. It could be some market feedback. It could be some feedback on a website. It could be some advice on competitors. It could be some market research. It could be anything, right? But by bringing a gift, by adding value to the conversation, not with your words, but with your actions, you're demonstrating the value you can bring. And if you notice in that story, when the interviewer said, "Tell me about yourself," he didn't talk about himself. What he did is he talked about the company and how he could add value to the company. He made the company the focus of the conversation. And if you can do that, you can immediately differentiate yourself from anybody else who's interviewing for the same job. So that's sort of my empathy rules are: do your homework. It's not about you, and bring a gift. And that's how you get a job.
Thank you so much for those tips. Those are very good. I was wondering, kind of as an employer from that perspective, could you give us some tips as to what the employer is looking for? You already said that they want to see how you fit into their company. Is there any kind of tips or tricks that you could give?
Well, part of the do your homework. So first of all, if you just send your resume through email blindly, you're less likely to get the job. It happens. It's possible. But it's like winning a lottery ticket. So it's better if you can get an introduction, a warm introduction. So trust, I'm a big believer. I have an investment thesis around trust. I think trust is really more important than most people realize. And in this instance, a trusted recommendation from somebody either inside the organization or somebody who knows somebody in the organization is always better than just throwing your resume in blindly. And, with tools like LinkedIn, you can always find somebody who works at that company and find a connection to them. And don't be afraid to pick up the phone or send an email and just say, hey, I'm thinking of interviewing for a job in the company. Can I ask you a few questions about what it's like to work in the company? Or can you make a recommendation to HR for me, whatever it is. But first piece of it is don't go in blind. Go in with a recommendation. The second piece is in doing your homework, you could, if it's a job that a teenager would get, a summer job is different than once you graduate college and you're looking for your first real job. But I think that what's really important is to be able to demonstrate your values. So your work ethic, you're going to show up on time, your demeanor about how you're going to act in a professional way. You're going to treat the customer. You're going to represent the company well. Because you don't have a lot of work experience or history, you have to talk about how you care about the value and talk about how you have a service orientation.
Thank you so much. And this is kind of one other question that I have, but could you describe your best and worst job interview experience, whichever one you would like, or both, and kind of tell us what you learned from those?
Well, I'll tell you my worst. So we didn't go over my background, but my history has mostly been as an entrepreneur. So I started 4 different businesses. I've been the CEO 4 times. So most of the time, very few times in my life I had a boss. But that said, the worst experience I had, I was interviewing for this 3-year nonprofit. It wasn't a job interview, but it was a educational program. It was a 3-year educational program, and I had it was 500 people applied for 20 slots, and I'm down to the final interview, and it's with 3 leaders of the organization, and they asked me about all my nonprofit work I've done. This was for a nonprofit thing, and I told them all why I was so excited about and how much I loved helping in the nonprofit world. And then they asked me, well, what don't you like? And my answer was fundraising. I really don't like asking people for money. Well, that was it. So it was a 2-hour interview, and the next hour and 55 minutes, they just sort of like dove in deep and ripped my soul apart and just like shredded me. But why, if I don't believe in the organization, like, if I believed in the organization, I wouldn't have any problem asking people for money to support it. And how come I didn't like asking people for money? And it was a terrible interview. Somehow I still got in. I got into that program, but oh my God, I was exhausted by the end of that interview. They just like ripped my soul, my psyche to pieces.
Dang, that must have been a really tough experience, especially for 2 hours.
Yeah, it was a brutal interview. I mean, I don't know if you guys know Redbox. Redbox is the movie kiosk in front of grocery stores. I was the chief innovation officer and the chief marketing officer for Redbox, and they had a philosophy that the higher you go in the organization, and this is when I reported to the CEO. You had to have multiple interviews. So I had to have 14 different interviews, and any one of the 14 people, if they said no, that was it. I was done. That's how Redbox did it. Redbox, like, and I had interviews with people who worked on, hourly wages, and I had, with senior executives and all sorts of different departments. And if one person said no, then I knew I wasn't going to get the job. That also was I got the job. It was a pressure-filled interviewing process.
So you kind of described the importance of empathy in this job application process. How would you define empathy? And there's a lot of different definitions. So what would be your personal definition for empathy?
Well, it's basically listening carefully enough to understand as best as possible what the person across the table is saying and why they're saying it and what's important to them and why it's important to them. And I feel that empathy in your personal life as well as your business life. So in business, I think most businesses fail. And we have a saying that nobody ever went out of business because they had too many customers. And so, or another way of saying that is the greatest product in the world without customers is a great product, but it's not a business. And part of the reason that people don't understand how to communicate or sell is they really don't understand their customer or how to talk to their customer or what's important to their customer. And so I think empathy is just critically important in all facets. As a boss, I've hired thousands and thousands of people across many companies. And it wasn't until I was later in my career when I realized I wanted to be the best manager I could possibly be. And that part of that journey and process was to put the needs of my employees ahead of my own personal needs. And when I made it about them and I became vested in their career progression, and they knew that I cared about their career progression, and my job was to make them look good and be successful, then we could do anything. It was incredible. So I think empathy is really important, and I've got one empathy story that I think would resonate with you guys. So my daughters, I have three daughters. We have three daughters who are 33, 31, and 23. So it's been a while, but when I first taught them how to drive, each of them how to drive, my first daughter was pretty easygoing, wasn't a problem. But my second daughter really liked to fight, and she was argumentative, and she had thin skin. And so I teach her the first time I teach her how to drive, the first lesson goes fine, no problem. The second time I teach her we're learning how to drive, I would start to repeat myself on purpose. And my daughter gets all huffy with me. It's like, "Ha, Dad, you've already taught me this. Like, you've already said this. Like, stop repeating yourself. What's wrong with you?" And, that wasn't fun. And I knew that that was going to continue. So that I really thought long and hard from her point of view and her perspective why she would act that way. So the next time, the third lesson, the next time I'm teaching her how to drive, same thing happens. I start to repeat myself. And she gets all huffy again. And I said, "Pull over." I said to her, "Do you ever see a movie about soldiers and basic training and boot camp?" She kind of looks at me and she goes, "Yeah." I go, "Did you ever notice that they drill, that they do the same thing over and over and over again?" She goes, "Huh, yeah." I go, "Do you know why they do that?" She goes, "I have no clue." I said, "Well, when you get into battle and there's smoke and noise like you can't believe and your senses are completely discombobulated and everything, your brain is screaming, 'Run away,' that the reason they drill is so that it becomes muscle memory, that you don't even have to think, that you know exactly what to do in the time of emergency, in the time of crisis, and that you do the right thing." I said to her, "The reason I'm repeating myself, I know how smart you are. I know that you can listen. The reason I'm repeating myself is not for when I'm in the car, it's for when I'm not in the car. So, you're going to get your license, and one day, God forbid, if hopefully you never find yourself in an emergency, but if there's something that happens, I want it to be muscle memory. I don't want you even have to think. I want you just to instinctively know what to do. And that's why I'm repeating myself." And she thought about it for a second. She went, "Well, okay, I understand that." And I said, "Okay, great. So you never have to yell again, right? You don't even have to, I'm not insulting you. I'm repeating myself on purpose. And if I repeat myself, all you have to do is go, okay." And she went, "Yeah, okay." And, I taught her how to drive, and we didn't fight. We fought about other things. we didn't fight about driving. And she got her license, and she turned out to be a great driver. But instead of emotionally engaging with her and just escalating the emotion, when I stopped and I explained the logic. So that's an example of empathy.
Yeah, I would say that's a really great example of really the power of empathy. But it seems that, especially in this kind of new climate with the internet, it's really hard for people to really empathize because there's not much face-to-face interaction. So what would you say is the hardest part about empathizing?
Well, humility. The humility to think somebody could add value, could have something important to say. That it's really hard to listen sometimes. And there's an old saying is you can't be learning if you're talking. And so part of empathy is listening and understanding and having the humility to know that you can learn something from somebody else.
Cool. Thank you so much. I think we can move on to finding joy. I really want to focus more on empathy and finding an interview, but I want to also get done with all of these different topics because they're all really important. So what would you say is the importance of joy? And what would you say is the difference between joy and happiness?
Well, so I have the advantage of perspective. So I'm 62 years old. I've been doing this for a while. And I worked at Apple in the very beginning days of Apple. I have some great Steve Jobs stories, Bill Gates stories from the beginning days. I've built 4 businesses. I've been a venture capitalist investing in dozens of businesses and helped build Redbox from 0 to a couple billion in revenue. And so I have the advantage of some perspective. And when I look backwards on my life, I have very few regrets, really enjoyed a wonderful, great family. And I'm very grateful for what I have in my career. But part of that perspective, looking backwards, is it's stressful. Raising a family and kids is not easy. I know it's hard to have that point of view and perspective when you're a teenager, but trust me, it's hard. And maybe you can understand a little bit how difficult it is when you look at your parents sometimes. But in starting businesses, it's been joyful, but boy, I've had, my first business did okay. My second business failed. It wasn't until my third business I actually did well. And, it was really hard and stressful. And I look backwards and I think there were not that many moments of real joy. And I'll give you one quick story. Maybe some of you guys have ever been to an overnight summer camp. One of my best jobs, one of my favorite jobs, I was a summer camp counselor when I was 20 for some teen campers who they were 14 at the time. This is in 1978. And all these years later, many of those campers are still some of my closest friends. So it was just that I just had this magical summer where everything worked out great. And to top it off, my best friend, who's still my best friend, was my co-counselor, and we shared a tent in the woods, a big old Army surplus tent. And we had to wake up at 6:30 in the morning every morning because flagpole was at 7:30, and we had to wake up the kids at 6:30. And one night we were out a little bit too late, and we came back the next morning came pretty early. 6:30 comes early, as some of you may think, and our alarm clock was set on a dresser away from our bed, so we had to get up. And the alarm was going off, and neither my best friend or myself, neither one of us were getting up. And I apologize for using bad language, just part of the story. So finally I said to my best friend, hey, asshole, which with love meant, it's your turn, get up and turn off the alarm. And we kind of swore back and forth until one of us burst into laughter, and we got up and did the alarm. And the next day, the same thing happened, where the alarm would go off, one of us would swear, the other person would swear back, and we'd go back and forth until we just burst into dumb, stupid, immature, teenage laughter. And that happened all summer long. And every morning I woke up laughing. And I look back upon that now, and it is such a gift, because think about your parents. Do you think your parents wake up every morning laughing? Probably not. Because life is hard. Life is difficult. There's a lot of stress out there in life. And so I use that as just an example, which is find the moments of joy. Because those moments of joy really matter.
Yeah. Right now, especially during a time where COVID-19 is shutting down a lot of aspects of our life, how would someone be able to find joy while being surrounded by all this uncertainty and negativity? What are small changes in your life you can do?
Well, I think readjust your expectations in terms of learning, reading, exploring, being creative, exploring your creativity, exploring partnerships online, forming communities. I do a lot of work in the nonprofit world. It's really important for me to give back, and I get a lot of joy out of giving back. And one of the organizations I'm connected with, we have a saying, which is, bring your whole self to something that's greater than yourself. And so one of the ways of finding joy is to actually do things for other people. and to do it in community and to give back. I think that is incredibly important.
Cool.
And rewarding. In fact, I sit on a lot of nonprofit boards, and I tell you that the friendships I have made and the lessons I have learned have in the nonprofit world have come across into the for-profit. I sit on dozens of for-profit boards as a venture capitalist, and I learn every bit as much from the nonprofit work I do as I do from the for-profit.
Thank you so much. And kind of in both worlds, nonprofit and for-profit, there is a real, I guess, need for leaders to really get stuff going and get people on the right track. So this is kind of the last topic I wanted to talk about, leadership. And how would you define a leader in today's world?
Well, so I think I'll talk about it from CEOs first. There's lots of different types of leaders. But in my world, which is the business world, I think a great leader sets a mission, creates something that's really large and aspirational. I call it a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal, a BHAG. And so they create this mission, and then they surround themselves with people so that they go hire a bunch of people to form a team that goes after that mission. The CEO's job is to get the resources, so it could be money, it could be relationships and partnerships, but to get the resources to the team for them to execute against the mission, and then pretty much get out of their way. If you hire the right people, they can do incredible things. And so I think of leadership is in that vein of articulating that larger goal, that larger vision, surrounding yourself with people who have the skills, the energy, the right attitude to go after that mission, and then make sure you give them the resources for them to be successful.
Cool. Thank you so much. Could you describe some examples of good leadership and bad leadership that you've experienced through your time with these different organizations?
Sure. I'll give you this story of Steve Jobs, which is both good and bad at the same time. So I was at Apple in 1983 and 1984, and I was the worldwide introduction manager for a new computer called the Apple IIc. It's a long, long time ago. And I spent a lot of time interacting with a young Steve Jobs at the time. We were both young. And I saw him, when he managed people. Well, I'll tell you how I manage people, then I'll tell you how he did it. And we'll contrast the two. If I had a project that was extra work, and I went to a team member and said, hey, I want you to work maybe nights or weekends on this extra project. Will you do it for me? And they do, and they work really hard. They work nights and weekends, and they come back, and on an arbitrary scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the best, maybe they did an 8. It was good work. It might even be great work. It was excellent work. As a CEO, I would say, thank you. Hey, thanks. I really appreciate the effort and the hard work, and thanks a lot. I saw Steve Jobs time and time again get into people's faces, screaming, like getting in their faces, screaming at the top of his lungs, spit almost coming out of his mouth onto people's faces, and just like, I can't believe you had the audacity to give me this load of crap. This sucks. And on that arbitrary scale of 0 to 10, he forced people out of sheer will to do an 11. Like, they would do work they didn't even know they had it in them. He was able to extract a level of quality of work that people didn't even know they were capable of doing. Now, when he did that, I saw people have nervous breakdowns. I saw people get divorced. I saw people quit, right? Because his expectation, he wouldn't settle for anything less than the best of the best, right? That was his expectation. And he cared more about the end result than he cared about the people.
Cool. Thank you so much. I think that's approximately enough time to start getting some viewer questions. So make sure you submit them into the YouTube live chat so I can be able to see them. We'll start with some members submitted questions about venture capital that I sent out. I sent out a form and they responded to this before the webinar. So my first question is, what is your favorite aspect about venture capital?
I love venture capital. I am so grateful to be able to do this. I love the intellectual journey of listening to excited entrepreneurs tell their stories and try to understand the problems that they're solving. And I really love building and growing and scaling businesses and taking a company from an idea into, a large company. To me, that's just joyful.
Cool. And now we're kind of getting into the more technical side of venture capital with these next two questions. Approximately what percentage of all the pitches you see do you provide with financial capital?
It's very small. So we at Math Venture Partners, we get approximately 1,700 companies a year that pitch us, and we make about 10 investments a year. So 1,700 come and present to us, 10 we invest in. So the odds of getting our money, it's not just us, these ratios are true for most venture capitalists. So the odds of getting money from a venture capitalist pretty slim.
What are the kind of, elements that you're looking for when you see these pitches? Like what are they being assessed on?
Yeah, so every venture capital firm is different, and each of us have a different investment thesis. And an investment thesis this is how we make decisions. So an example in the venture capital world, it could be by geography. We only invest in Chicago, or we only invest in Silicon Valley. Or it could be by stage. We only invest in seed early at the very beginning, or we only invest in the middle or later stage companies. It could be by industry group. So there's some VCs that only invest in healthcare, or SaaS businesses, B2B SaaS businesses, or fintech, or cybersecurity. So you can have a focus on industry vertical. So Math Venture Partners, we invest in software companies. We invest earlier stage, first real round of institutional capital. And our investment thesis is around sales. We love companies who know how to sell, who have an unfair advantage in customer acquisition, leveraging the sales model. Because I just said that 1,700 companies apply, 10 get our money. According to the National Venture Capital Association, of all the companies that get venture capital money, and knowing that most can't, of the ones who do, the best of the best of the best, 67% of them fail. So now, 67% of the 10 fail. So, like I said before, nobody ever went out of business because they had too many customers. So most entrepreneurs focus on solving the problem. They don't focus on how do they sell. And we place a great deal of emphasis on how to sell.
Thank you so much. And this is the last pre-submitted question. Is it possible to get into venture capital without being wealthy?
Sure.
And I guess what kind of tips would you give to someone trying to get into venture capital?
Well, so there's three ways of doing it. um, you can get an MBA, and so about half the VCs I know uh, come work their way through, got an MBA, and then from their MBA program went into venture capital. So that's one route through the MBA. Another is as an operator. So there are entrepreneurs like myself, when I sold one of my companies, who have operating experience and have domain expertise, have really good expertise in a particular segment, industry segment, and they have built the trust with the VCs who back them. And it's very much a trust and relationship business. And so if you have the trust of and a strong relationship with some VCs, I've seen entrepreneurs be invited in to being a VC. And then the third way is you have your own wealth, that you start your own fund.
Thank you. So now we're going to transition to the YouTube live chat questions. There are currently 2, and they're pretty good. I would say the first one is, what's a common denominator of the entrepreneurs you fund and succeed?
I think they have a bias towards action. I think one of the things that really good entrepreneurs, they do more with less, and they're persistent and tenacious, and they just knock walls down till they get what they need to get to. Because it's so hard to be an entrepreneur. Everybody expects that you're going to fail, and most do. And so you just have to be tenacious as all heck.
Thank you. And then this is the second question. And make sure to keep on asking them, because right now, this is a lot of experience that you can get. But how many of the companies you invest in go on to become successful? Can you give examples of your favorites?
Yeah, so I invested in a company called Sure Payroll. You might see them on they have lots of commercials on TV now. They were the first payroll provider on the internet, and it turned into a pretty large company. I met my partner, Troy Hennekoff. Troy was the CEO of Sure Payroll. I was the lead investor and chairman of the board of the company. This is 20 years ago, and we built that company together. We had a very nice exit, and now we're partners in Math Venture Partners. That's
awesome.
an example.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I have a little bit more questions that I can ask, but make sure if you're a viewer that you have any questions, asking them, because we still have 15 minutes left, and I want everyone to make sure that they have something they can learn from this. So I'll ask a question about empathy, if that's all right with you. Could you describe, I guess, another situation that you've seen where empathy is a necessary tool for success?
Yeah, I think the very best salespeople really understand their customers and their problem solvers. They're not trying just to sell whatever it is they have to sell. They're really trying to, in the best interest of their customers, help them grow their business. And so one of the questions I ask of salespeople are, what are the KPIs of your customer, of your champion? And a KPI stands for Key Performance Indicator. And oftentimes, large companies or companies, they have bonuses at the end of the year. Those bonuses are predicated upon some measurable KPIs, key performance indicators, like top-line revenue, bottom-line profitability, customer satisfaction scores. There's a whole series of KPIs. And I say to the salespeople, what are the KPIs of your champion? How does your champion get a bonus at the end of the year? Because if you really understand the financial levers of what's important, and you understand the language of your customer and how your customer talks about their own business. Most entrepreneurs are so focused on what they do, they can't listen. It's what they do to the exclusion of what's important to the customer. So let me put it another way. So when I was at Redbox, I was the interim chief marketing officer for a while, and my KPIs there were frequency, basket size, nights out. And what that means is frequency. We had 1/3 of all U.S. households at the time renting a movie from us every month. So think about that. 1/3 of all U.S. households. So that was over 80 million transactions a month. So if I could get you to come 2 times a month versus 1 time a month, that's frequency. How often do you come to the kiosk? Then that was huge to us. That really moved the needle. Basket size was, could you rent 2 movies instead of 1 movie? Or could you rent a movie and a game? And nights out, our business model at the time was $1 a night. So if you kept it 2 nights, we made more money than if you kept it 1 night. But when I was the interim chief marketing officer, I cared about frequency, basket size, nights out. And if you were an entrepreneur and you were trying to sell me something and you didn't talk in my language, in my KPIs, and didn't tell me how I could improve frequency, basket size, nights out, then you didn't get my business. So, going back to empathy, it's not about you, it's about the person sitting across the table from you. And most entrepreneurs make this mistake. When they come and pitch me as a VC, they say our product does feature. And I say, I don't care. I really don't care. What I want you to talk about is, from the voice of the customer, what problem are you solving from the customer's point of view, and why is that problem so urgent they're going to trust you, a startup, to solve it?
Thank you. Now we have a couple more questions from the live chat. The first one being, what would you recommend a high school senior about to go to college in terms of skills? And some of these are skills to succeed in the startup.
So it depends on what you want to do, but if you want to be in a startup, I would say you should have some programming skills. You should have some tech skills. Even if you don't want to be a programmer, just the baseline, because it's really important. So here's another thing about human nature, is we gravitate towards our strengths and we avoid our weaknesses. I know a lot of people who say, I'm not good at math, or I'm not good at programming, or I'm not good at fill in the blank. And if you want to be an entrepreneur, especially a tech entrepreneur, it would be good to have a baseline. You don't have to be a programmer, but what you need is the ability to not be bullshitted by programmers. So you got to have a baseline of knowledge. Same thing with accounting. I don't know about you guys. I hated my accounting. Hated it. I mean, I barely got a C in accounting when I was in college. But I needed it, because if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you got to be able to read a P&L statement and a balance sheet. Once again, you don't have to be an accountant, but you just have to have enough familiarity. And so if you want to be an entrepreneur, I would focus on sales. Sales is essential. I'd focus on a baseline of programming knowledge and technology, and I'd focus on a baseline of accounting knowledge. Once again, you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to be an accountant. Maybe it's just one class, but you should have a baseline.
Thank you. And we have one final question from the YouTube live chat. As a person who has tried to get internships with startups, what are some of the best practices in order to get them?
Well, first of all, go through a trusted source. Don't just send a resume. Find somebody find somebody who works in that organization, or knows somebody who works in that organization, and go through a trusted source. The other is really do your homework and find out everything you can know about that company, and figure out a way to demonstrate your value add. So the way you think about it right now is, I need a job or I need an internship, and it's about me. What can the company do for me? Flip the frame. Figure out what you can do for the company. And so make yourself indispensable. Like, figure out a way to make it about the company and not about you.
Thank you. Right now, there's 2 more questions on the YouTube live chat. They're kind of, I guess, tied hand in hand. What are some of the problems that need to be solved in your opinion? And what industry do you see to be the most lucrative in the next 15 years?
Well, let me ask that one first. I wish I knew. If I knew the answer to that, I would be a much better venture capitalist than I am today. I think the answer is the world. It's so hard to predict 15 years from now, at least for me. I've always been really good at picking out 3 or 5 years from now. I've always been ahead of the curve, but 15 years is really hard. I can't imagine. But I'll give you an example. Cybersecurity. The bad guys, which are oftentimes foreign governments, are outspending the good guys. And cybersecurity, as this world goes online more and more, as the world becomes more mobile, being able to protect our digital assets, I think is going to be incredibly important and only growing in urgency, as an example.
Thank you. And then, so you kind of touched on cybersecurity, but what are some of the other problems that you might see that need to be solved, I guess that will be solved in these next years?
Well, I think healthcare. I think there's a lot of opportunity and innovation in healthcare around all aspects of healthcare. I think that transportation, let's call it city planning, city engineering. I think the cities of today are going to go through some pretty dramatic changes, and I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity about reimagining what city life is and how we, for example, this week, the city of Seattle just closed 20 downtown streets. And the reason they closed to car traffic. And the reason they did is they wanted to give pedestrians more space to walk and not be so clumped together like on a sidewalk. And so I think clean energy, I think global warming is a huge opportunity for innovation.
Thank you. And we have 2 more questions. So the first one is, what's the best way to get experience in the business world? Would you say through big companies or startups?
Yes. I'm joking. But it depends on what you want. I actually found that when I went to work at Apple, I learned a ton. I was really glad to have the experience of working in a large company and understanding the value and the power of large companies. And I also really appreciated startups, because startups, it's really hard for large companies to innovate. And I love the creativity and the opportunity to innovate and to come up with new things. And so I think the answer is both.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Thank you. And then we have one other question. If you had to start all over again, what would you do, or what skills would you kind of keep with you?
Well, I'll leave it with empathy again. When I joined Redbox, I was 50 years old, and I was an okay boss. I wasn't a great boss. I was good at raising money. I was good at managing investors and shareholders, but I was just average as a boss. And I decided that that when I went to Redbox, that I was going to really hone and practice my management skills. And when I did that and really zeroed in on empathy, not only did I become a better manager, I became a better business person and maybe a better person all around. And it was really late. I was 50 years old before I figured that out. I'm a slow learner, but that's what I would, if there was anything I could say to my younger self, that's what I would say is, and to be kind.
Thank you so much. We're kind of nearing the end of our, I guess, time for the webinar. Is there anything you would like to have, any stories, other stories you would like to tell, anything that you would like to say?
No, just go for it. So I have had a very eclectic career, and my joke is I think I've had a fun and eclectic career, and my wife thinks I can't hold a job. If you look at my LinkedIn profile, I have had lots of different types of things, and I follow your passion, follow your joy, be intellectually curious, and couple that with humility and kindness. Because don't underestimate the importance of humility and kindness.
Thank you so much. I believe that wraps up our webinar. Thank you, Mr. Achler, for taking the time out of your day to answer our questions. And I'd also like to thank everyone so much for attending this webinar. Hopefully you learned something new that you can incorporate into your daily routine and daily life looking forward. I know I did. And if you haven't done so already, make sure to just subscribe to the JEC's YouTube channel and look for more videos on the horizon. Thank you so much, Mr. Achler.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Al.
Bye.